This opening shot of In a Lonely Place is really classic. Lead actor, leading Hollywood celebrity Humphrey Bogart, his name plastered in huge letters across the screen, and his eyes in the mirror as if avoiding himself, like refusing to look at himself. Everything is about Humphrey Bogart except for Humphrey Bogart. That self-conflictedness, I think, is a central theme in the movie. It's a conflictedness not just between two sides of a character, but sort of between two forms of personhood. On the one hand, the assumption of a essential identity of one kind or another, that there is some kind of essential core identity to your personhood. And then on the other hand, I think what's closer to reality, sort of the ongoing, fluid, unfolding person, the person that's always up for determination, always under negotiation in the process of life, in the process of social interaction and action, living. That's what life is, right? Is ongoing process rather than completed process of a person's development. Sort of death is the completion. A couple years before Humphrey Bogart starred in A Lonely Place, he starred in Dark Passage with Lauren Bacall. Very interesting movie in which he plays escaped prison. You see him here sneaking out in this barrel on a truck. And in the first third of the movie is, except for a couple shots like this one, filmed from his perspective. So we don't actually ever see Humphrey Bogart during this section of the movie. The camera sees what he sees, and we get a little voiceover. And it begins with this great shot from inside the barrel as he rolls down the hills. And he climbs out onto the road and hitches a ride.
Here comes something. I gotta take that chance now. How'd you get your feet wet? Been waiting? Across the stream back there. Couldn't see a bridge, so I waded across. Where you going? San Francisco?
So he knocks this guy out and pulls over and steals his clothes. And just then, Lauren Bacall arrives, a total stranger he doesn't know, to help him escape.
All right. Let's climb in my car and get out of here fast.
What is this?
You're lucky he's still alive. Let's go. I want to help you.
Why?
Please, we haven't much time, Vincent.
How'd you know my name?
Does that matter?
Then it turns into a kind of Frankenstein story when he has his face transformed to look totally different. So a new character is created that is Humphrey Bogart. So it's an interesting representation of the celebrity. We see Humphrey Bogart now as a confection. And I think that's an interesting experience for the audience, identifying with this constructed artificial face, artificial person. And Lauren Bacall is characterized as a anonymous public fan. She followed Vincent's trial and believes in his innocence, and so comes out of nowhere to help him. So pretty interesting allegory of the celebrity fan relationship. sort of a fan's fantasy of relationship with a celebrity that's getting played out by, the most famous Hollywood couple ever at the time. I think the richness with which the theme of performative constructed identity is explored here really suggests a public fascination with that theme, an acknowledgement of the power and importance of constructed identity as both, romantic fantasy, the kind of glamour that Humphrey Bogart always represents, maybe also paranoid, worry about needing or wanting to escape one's actual identity.
It's time, Vincent. It's time for the bandages to come off.
Well, that bad?
It's unbelievable. But it's good. I think I even like you better.
Well, don't let it give you any ideas.
What kind?
Don't change yours. I like it just as it is.
So I think In a Lonely Place is similarly about the kind of Frankenstein creature, our public alter ego, the way we're perceived by others as some kind of determinate identity. It's very hard not to pigeonhole each other into, particular slots, being particular kinds of person. That question that rules in A Lonely Place: is Dix the kind of person who could be a murderer? But that kind of alter ego of our objectified identity in the eyes of other people, I think it's a normal part of social life in general, but maybe even much more so today with all our social media. We're, self commodifying all over the place. So this kind of disconnect between our perspective in the ongoing, always incomplete flow of experience, in which our identity is always an incomplete work in progress, and all the ways in which we're perceived, identified as particular identities. Performative social meanings, gender as this performed meaning. Recognition of these qualities is as much a part of the performance as the performance of the qualities themselves. Again, social meanings are part of this, continuous conversation about who we are. That's a back and forth that's always changing over time. And yet we treat people often like they are one thing or another in an essential way. An incredibly significant consequence of this performative view on social meaning and identity is being recognized more and more in psychology, that our identity is a consequence of our behavior rather than a cause of our behavior. So that, which is a reversal of our typical Cartesian perspective, the performative construction of meaning, that I am what I do. I receive my sense of myself from how I behave rather than the other way around.
So in the animal kingdom, they are about expanding. So you make yourself big, you stretch out, you take up space, you're basically opening up. It's about opening up. And this is true across the animal kingdom. It's not just limited to primates, and humans do the same thing. So they do this both when they have power sort of chronically, and also when they're feeling powerful in the moment. And this one is especially interesting because it really shows us how universal and old these expressions of power are. This expression, which is known as pride, Jessica Tracy has studied, she shows that people who are born with sight and people who are congenitally blind do this when they win at a physical competition. So when they cross the finish line and they've won, it doesn't matter if they've never seen anyone do it, they do this. So the arms up in the V, the chin is slightly lifted. What do we do when we feel powerless? We do exactly the opposite. We close up, we wrap ourselves up, we make ourselves small. We don't want to bump into the person next to us. So again, both animals and humans do the same thing. And this is what happens when you put together high and low power. So what we tend to do when it comes to power is that we complement the other's nonverbals. So if someone's being really powerful with us, we tend to make ourselves smaller. We don't mirror them, we do the opposite of them. I noticed a couple things about this. One, you're not going to be surprised, it seems to be related to gender. So women are much more likely to do this kind of thing than men. Women feel chronically less powerful than men, so this is not surprising. But the other thing I noticed is that it also seemed to be related to the extent to which the students were participating and how well they were participating. And this is really important in the MBA classroom because participation counts for half the grade. So business schools have been struggling with this gender grade gap. You get these equally qualified women and men coming in, and then you get these differences in grades, and it seems to be partly attributable to participation. So I started to wonder, okay, so you have these people coming in like this and they're participating. Is it possible that we could get people to fake it, and would it lead them to participate more? So my main collaborator, Dana Carney, who's at Berkeley, and I really wanted to know, can you fake it till you make it? Like, can you do this just for a little while and actually experience a behavioral outcome that makes you seem more powerful?
So that fake it till you make it principle is pretty fascinating. And, people that do perform, music, dance, athletics are familiar with that. Acting confident can make you feel that way. Again, I find that very super counterintuitive. I feel like that really goes against our normative sense of identity. We think of ourselves first as this internal consciousness, and our bodies are supposed to reflect that. I think, therefore, I am defines being as this kind of transcendence of the body. And I think we're kind of used to that. So recognizing our minds as susceptible to manipulation through the body is both perhaps disturbing, disorienting, but ultimately empowering, I think. I think a disturbing dimension of it is explored in the love scene in Blade Runner, where it's sort of a noir hero detective who's pursuing a femme fatale whose danger comes from not being human, from being a programmed automaton. So this is a love scene, but it could also be a rape scene because she's uncertain herself whether she's actually human or programmed. She's in this scene, she's wondering if the memories she has are actually her own or if they were planted. She's uncertain whether to get romantic with him because she doesn't know whether she's a robot or not, whether it's actually her choice or not.
Beautifully.
It's a really disturbing scene to watch, I think. But I also think it touches on this ambiguity where intentionality lies. Um, he seems to suggest there's a kind of formula. Say, kiss me. Like, there's a formula to erotic reciprocation. I mean, what's troubling about this scene is his entitlement. He, he, he thinks, because you're a robot, you can't say no. But like the memories, if you have the memories, does it matter if they were implanted or not? He seems to be suggesting the same thing about sexual reciprocation, that there's a certain formula of behavior. In fact, a UBC professor, Mandy Lee Catron, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that became super popular, and she turned it into a book about an attempt back in the 50s to find a formula for making people fall in love in a laboratory setting, a sort of clinical formula for inducing love in the lab. You can find the questionnaire here. So you ask each other questions, just basically questions about your life. But it's this, it's the same premise that there is a formula to mutual compassion and inspiration. Another interesting detail, it's not just a questionnaire. There's also an element which is looking into each other's eyes for 4 minutes straight. But that's, again, the same idea that there's formula for bonding, that it's fascinating. It's, troubling, disorienting, because we're so deeply attached to the idea that our choices, especially erotic choices, are expressive of who we are. So to think that it could be induced in an impersonal way challenges that sense of expressive choice. But again, I think you can look at it the other way around. Choice is just something that happens in the world. It's limited by the conditions of real life in the world. Like everything else, that's a famous line by Karl Marx, that people make their own history, but not exactly as they choose. They make it with the pre-existing conditions and opportunities that are available. So it's just about having a little more subtle and realistic conception of what freedom means in the real world. It takes place under real conditions and exhibits patterns of regularity that are not prescriptive. They don't prescribe how we express ourselves, but they set certain limits and probabilities on how we exercise our freedom. Ultimately, the crucial thing to bear in mind, I think, is that if you think of freedom in terms of the practical opportunities the world actually gives you to be free, that is much more empowering, enriching, than thinking of it in abstract terms as the capacity to choose whatever you want. Absolutely, that's actually kind of empty and maybe more confining, even though it sounds much more expansive. It's just an idea. Whereas if you think of freedom as positive determinate opportunities available to you in the world, the world can teach you how to be free. That's a lot richer, larger, more diverse set of possibilities of freedom. There's a really interesting thing that Amy Cuddy mentions in this TED Talk. It's this gesture called pride. The way we recognize pride in one another. And that seems like such a basic characteristic, whatever all your other characteristics may be. Pride seems like a foundational condition of identity. What she says here is so interesting, that this gesture is universal, but it's also recognized by congenitally blind people who have never seen anything. It makes me think of the theme of blindness in Frankenstein. In our prehistory as a species, was communicated physically through this gesture. But now that we're a linguistic species, it's also communicated through the word. You're sincere. There's something in your words that convinces me you're sincere. I think that's very interesting, thinking about language as an extension of the body. Certainly how Mary Shelley is exploring in Frankenstein is how the technology of the novel, that, media communications technology that is the novel, creates and transmits a creature, a relationship to a creature. And, that's sort of a theme in the novel as well, that a lack of pride, due to a lack of compassion within the world of the novel. So it's really a technology for creating personhood. In the same way it's getting explored in Blade Runner. It's a formula. It's a set of words on a page that you read through, just like Harrison Ford's trying to enforce this formula. It's interesting in both. There's a kind of script for personhood. It's getting tested. I think I've shown you these statistics before. It represent the same thing that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is exploring, this failure to account people. People are unequally represented in language itself. So in he said, she said scenarios, attention is paid unequally. So I wonder if it would be fair to say about that ambiguous scene in Blade Runner that the problem is not trying to impose a kind of script or formula on sexual reciprocation, but it's a question of how good the script is, how nuanced and complex. That's a lesson I take from the novel Frankenstein, is that it offers a much richer script for recognizing personhood than actual patriarchal society. So an idea I'd like you to think about, a thesis of this seminar really, is that like the kind of texts we're reading, these films, poems, and fiction, amount to technologies of pride, technologies of rewriting, negotiating what is recognized as personhood. It's something that the Charlie Chaplin classic movie City Lights shares, I think, with Frankenstein, is using the trope of blindness to teach us to see the sort of limitless capacity of technology like cinema and fiction to acknowledge creatures. City Lights thematizes the representation of pride right from the beginning with a city ceremony unveiling a monumental marble statue, contrasted with the embarrassment of the tramp's body as a blemish that doesn't belong in the frame, doesn't belong in the scene, that socially normative gaze would eradicate from the scene, would erase, until he runs into a blind woman, a flower girl who, like DeLacy, whose blindness allows her to see a person. story of City Lights is that he steals money for her to get a surgery to restore her sight and goes to jail. And so it ends here with him after he's released, wandering around, and he runs into the flower girl. She recognizes him from the feeling of his hands and then learns to see with new eyes. The tramp that was a blemish to be eradicated from the scene becomes the new focus of the scene. That's what I mean by a technology of pride. Cinema is used to reconstruct our sense of what counts as a person. The world is rewired, reconstructed. Her sense of how the world is populated, it's much more profound than just getting your sight restored. Like a lyric poem or a song that's testing our ability to respond, or like an erotic appeal, giving somebody a rose, testing for reciprocation. So, a lot like Mary Shelley's Creature, Charlie Chaplin's Tramp tests the limits of our ability to recognize personhood. It's like the Turing test for artificial intelligence. Functional mutual recognition. We are nothing else besides all the myriad ways in which we recognize one another in our communications media. That's all we've ever been, is a way of communicating. Our ideas of one another are nothing but a conceit, in a way, that allows for all the specific kinds of communication that we do. Fundamental argument in Frankenstein, how we reproduce each other through our communication. That's the condition of any other kind of reproduction.